They say that deep in the jungles of Borneo, if you smell the strangely sweet scent of the frangipani flower in the dead of night, don't go looking for it. Run, because it's the sign of the Pontianak, a vengeful spirit that preys on the lost. Of course, I didn't believe in things like that. I believed in things I could analyze. Gravity, engine failure, and the sheer, rotten luck that threw me from a falling plane right into its territory. This is the story of my survival in the wild, a struggle that quickly turned into a desperate escape from something not of this world. A fight not just against predators and the elements, but against a ghost born of grief and hatred, a predator that science has no explanation for. The drone of the single-prop engine was a familiar, grating lullaby, the kind that accompanied too many of my fragmented memories. Another puddle-jumper flight over another endless expanse of green, this time cutting across the heart of Borneo. The air inside the cramped cabin was thick with the smells of sweat and aviation fuel, a cocktail I'd become far too accustomed to. The mission parameters were a blur, fragments of a briefing held in a sterile room that felt a million miles away. Something about, quote, anomalous biological signals near Pontianak. Agency speak for a monster they wanted cataloged or neutralized. My handler for this trip, a man whose face I couldn't picture but whose voice was a cold monotone over a satellite phone, had been deliberately vague. The only clear image that surfaced was a fleeting memory of Marcus Thorne's face, a sneer playing on his lips just before I boarded. A face I knew I was supposed to hate, though the reasons were lost in the fog of my amnesia. Then the lullaby turned into a scream. It started with a violent shudder that rattled the teeth in my skull. The engine's steady roar coughed, sputtered, and then twisted into a high-pitched shriek of failing machinery. Outside my window, the serene green carpet of the jungle canopy tilted at an impossible angle. The pilot, a wiry man who hadn't said more than 5 words to me, was now shouting frantically into his radio, his words swallowed by the chaos. A sickening lurch of lost altitude pulled me against my restraints. Metal groaned, a final protest it was about to lose. My mind, the stubborn, logical part of me, tried to calculate trajectories and impact forces. But instinct, a more primal and honest part of me, simply braced for the end. The world became a blender of green, brown, and a final, concussive black. The first thing to return was the smell. Acrid smoke, the sharp tang of hot metal, and the cloying, wet earth scent of the jungle floor. Then came the pain. A fire lancing up my leg, a dull symphony of aches everywhere else. I forced my eyes open. I was hanging upside down, held by my safety harness. Through a spiderweb of cracks in the cockpit glass, I saw steam hissing from the mangled engine. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unnervingly still. A quick check confirmed what I already knew. I was the sole survivor. Courage. Survival mode kicked in, a familiar switch flipping in my head. Unbuckling the harness sent me crashing onto the cabin ceiling, the impact jarring my already bruised ribs. I ignored it. I kicked out a shattered window and crawled from the smoking metal coffin, dragging my injured leg behind me. The humidity hit me like a physical blow, a thick, wet blanket that promised to suck the life out of anything that stood still for too long. I was alone, surrounded by a wall of vegetation so dense it seemed to swallow the light and sound. The wreckage behind me was a grotesque scar on a pristine world. As the adrenaline began to fade, a cold assessment took its place. I limped a safe distance away and took inventory. My cargo pants were torn, but the contents of its pockets were mostly intact. My combat knife, its grip worn smooth from use. My Zippo lighter, the old brass case engraved with a name I didn't recognize. My small leather-bound notebook, my external memory, was miraculously dry in its waterproof pouch. And around my neck, cold against my skin, was the metal dog tag. No name, no rank. Just the stark, stylized logo of the agency. I looked up. The canopy was so thick, I could barely see the sky. The sun was setting, painting the few patches of visible clouds in hues of orange and purple. As the last sliver of light bled from the sky, the jungle began to breathe. The gentle hum of insects swelled into a chattering, clicking, buzzing orchestra of the unseen. I was alone. Utterly, completely alone. And as the first true darkness fell, I had the chilling certainty that something out there was now aware of it. Dawn in the jungle isn't a gentle awakening, it's an assault. The humidity, already suffocating, intensified with the rising sun, turning the air into a hot, wet towel I couldn't escape. My leg was a throbbing beacon of pain, the gash above my knee now an angry red, inflamed and hot to the touch. The first, telltale signs of infection. The brutal reality of my situation settled in with the morning light. The few gulps of water I'd salvaged were gone. My stomach was a hollow ache. The jungle didn't care about my past, the agency, or the machinations that led me here. It presented a simple, ruthless equation. Find water, find food, and deal with this wound, or become another decomposing piece of its ecosystem. I pushed myself up, leaning heavily on a sturdy branch I'd fashioned into a crude crutch. Every movement was a negotiation with pain, but the alternative was a slow death beneath the indifferent canopy. I had to move. I had to think. And as I started to assess my surroundings, something strange happened. Knowledge began to surface, unbidden, like bubbles rising from a deep, dark lake. My eyes scanned the forest floor, not with the panic of a lost man, but with the focus of a collector. I recognized the way the ground sloped, the specific type of ferns that thrived in perpetually damp soil. Water collects in low-lying areas. The thought wasn't a guess, it was a fact. I followed the logic of the terrain, limping through thick undergrowth until I heard it. The faint, blessed trickle of running water. It was a muddy-looking stream, but it was life. I remembered a process, a sequence of actions as clear as if I'd read them from a manual an hour ago. I tore a strip of cloth from my shirt, packed it with charcoal from a lightning-scorched tree, and filtered the water into my empty flask. The next challenge was food. My gaze swept over the plant life. Most of it was an alien tapestry of green, but here and there a familiar shape would jump out. The broad leaves of a taro plant, its starchy root a reliable source of carbohydrates if cooked properly. The tightly packed heart of a young palm tree. My hands moved with a certainty my mind lacked, using my knife to harvest what I could. It felt less like invention and more like recollection. Where did I learn this? Was I a botanist? A soldier? A Boy Scout with a PhD in desperation? The answers were buried, but the skills were right here, in my hands. With the immediate threats of thirst and starvation temporarily at bay, I knew I needed shelter before the next nightfall. The jungle was unforgiving to the exposed. I found a rock outcropping that offered a natural overhang. I spent the next several hours weaving a lattice of branches to form a lean-to against the rock, then layering it with large, waxy leaves I instinctively knew would repel water. The motions were rhythmic, efficient. My body knew the task, even if my conscious mind was a spectator. As the sun began its descent once more, I sat by a small, controlled fire, my leg bandaged with boiled cloth and a poultice of crushed leaves that the ghost of a memory told me had antiseptic properties. I had water. I had a meager portion of roasted taro root. I had a shelter. By all accounts, I should have felt a sliver of victory. Instead, I felt a profound and sudden unease. It wasn't the cacophony of the jungle's nightlife starting its chorus. This was different. It was a silence in a specific direction. A cold, deliberate pressure on the back of my neck, the kind of focus you feel just before a predator strikes. My hand went to the hilt of my knife. I slowly scanned the impenetrable wall of shadows beyond my firelight. I saw nothing. No glowing eyes, no rustling leaves. But the feeling didn't leave. The jungle was no longer just a neutral force of nature. Something in it was aware of me. Something was watching. Night fell like a shroud, swift and absolute. My small fire was a lonely island of orange light in an ocean of blackness, pushing back the oppressive dark. but also making the shadows around me deeper, more menacing. I sat with my back pressed against the cold stone of the outcropping, my knife resting on my thigh. The jungle's nocturnal symphony was in full swing, a relentless, overlapping chorus of insects, the distant call of some unknown primate, the rustle of small things in the undergrowth. It was a soundscape that could drive a man mad, but I forced myself to treat it as white noise, a constant I could filter out to listen for the variables, the snap of a twig, the growl of a predator. For hours, there was nothing but the usual. I ate the last of my roasted taro, the starchy texture a poor substitute for a real meal, but it was fuel. I redressed the wound on my leg, which was still throbbing but seemed less inflamed. The logical part of my brain was focused on the next day's plan: follow the stream, hope it leads to a larger river, and eventually, civilization. Then I heard it. Boy. It came on the edge of the wind, so faint at first I thought I'd imagined it. A thin, high-pitched sound that cut through the chirping of the cicadas. It was a wail. A long, mournful cry, filled with an impossible depth of sorrow. A woman's cry. My first thought was a rational one. A bird. The jungle is full of mimics, birds that can sound like anything from a car alarm to a crying baby. My exhausted, stressed mind was probably playing tricks on me, projecting human sounds onto the unfamiliar calls of the local fauna. I stoked the fire, its crackling a comforting, man-made sound against the wildness. I told myself to ignore it, but the sound came again, a little closer this time. It wasn't the repetitive, mindless call of an animal. This sound had nuance. It held a story of loss and despair. It rose and fell with the cadence of genuine grief, a soul-wrenching lament that seemed to hang in the humid air. I found myself holding my breath, straining to listen. That's when it changed. Nahabile ko wentamara. The sorrowful wail was abruptly cut short, replaced by a soft, chilling giggle. It was a playful sound, almost childish, yet utterly devoid of joy. It was the sound of something deeply wrong, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The wailing had been unsettling, the laughter was terrifying. It skittered along my nerves, raising the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck. My hand closed around the grip of my knife, my knuckles white. The feeling of being watched from the night before returned tenfold, now with a voice to accompany it. I scanned the perimeter of my firelight, my eyes darting into the impenetrable blackness beyond. The laughter faded, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was heavy, expectant. Ayadakhabda kibda ram marahaba. This was no bird. This was not my imagination. Whatever was out there in the dark with me, it was intelligent. And it knew I was here. I was no longer just a survivor. I was prey. Sleep had been a luxury I couldn't afford. The night was spent in a state of hypervigilance, my senses stretched to their breaking point, waiting for the wailing or laughter to return. It never did, but its absence was just as unnerving. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy, it was a profound relief. The shadows retreated, and with them, some of the primal fear. But the memory of that sound lingered, a cold knot in my gut. Staying put was no longer an option. Whatever was out here with me, it had my location pinpointed. My only chance was to keep moving, to make myself a harder target. I smothered the last embers of my fire, gathered my meager supplies and set off, following the stream as planned. My leg protested with every step, but the fear was a more potent motivator than the pain. The jungle felt different today. No longer just a challenging environment, it was now the hunting ground of an unseen adversary. I found myself scanning my surroundings with a new, sharper focus, looking for anything out of place. It didn't take long to find it. The first sign was a cluster of broken branches on a tree about 10 feet off the ground. They weren't snapped by a falling limb or a climbing animal. They were bent and fractured downwards, as if something of significant weight had landed there from above. There were no corresponding tracks on the ground below. It was physically illogical. A few hundred yards further downstream, I was hit by a smell. It was sudden and overwhelming. cutting through the damp, earthy scent of the jungle. A sweet, cloying fragrance, floral. My fragmented knowledge base supplied a name, frangipani, plumeria, the flowers used in layas and temple offerings. It was a beautiful scent. But here, in the middle of nowhere, with no such flowers in sight, it was deeply unsettling. The air was thick with it for 20 paces, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that shattered any lingering rational explanation, was on a damp, sandy bank of the stream where I had stopped to refill my flask. Footprints. They were delicate, unmistakably human, and clearly belonging to a woman with small, bare feet. They emerged from the dense tree line, walked a few steps towards the water's edge, and then simply stopped. There were no tracks leading away. Not into the water, not back into the jungle, not up into the trees. They just ended. As if the person who made them had vanished into thin air. I stared at the footprints, the evidence laid out before me. Broken branches high in the trees, a phantom floral scent. Footprints that appeared from nowhere and led to nothing. My logical mind was screaming in protest, searching for an explanation, for any explanation, that fit within the known laws of physics. But there was none. My hand instinctively went to my pack and pulled out my notebook. I flipped through the pages filled with my own hurried handwriting, scrawled notes on cryptids, local legends, paranormal phenomena. My eyes scanned entries on the chupacabra, the yeti, the Jersey Devil. Then I saw a page with a single word scrawled at the top, a note from a previous, forgotten investigation into Southeast Asian folklore, Pontianak. The details were sparse, just a few bullet points I must have jotted down. Vengeful female spirit, died in childbirth. Huntsmen, scent of frangipani, a high-pitched cry. My blood ran cold. I wasn't just lost, I was being hunted. And my hunter wasn't an animal, it was a myth, a ghost story made flesh, and I was trespassing in its domain. Pushing through the jungle with a newfound urgency, I stumbled upon it by accident. A break in the impossibly thick vegetation revealed a small, silent clearing. In the center stood the skeletons of half a dozen wooden huts, raised on stilts, their thatched roofs long since rotted away and reclaimed by vines. It was a village, abandoned decades ago by the looks of it, a ghost of a community swallowed by the green tide. Caution warred with a desperate need for information. This was a sign of human life, however ancient. There might be tools, clues, anything to help me understand what I was facing. I limped into the clearing, the silence of the place weighing heavily on me. This wasn't the vibrant, noisy quiet of the jungle. It was the dead quiet of a place where life had ceased to be. I chose the largest of the structures, what might have been a communal longhouse, and carefully climbed the rickety ladder onto its decaying floorboards. Inside, the gloom was thick. Shafts of light pierced through holes in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. Most of the contents had been lost to time and humidity, but something on the far wall caught my eye. Carvings. They were crude, etched into the dark wood with some sharp tool, but their meaning was terrifyingly clear. The panels told a story. The first showed happy villagers, fishing and farming. The next depicted a woman, her belly swollen with child. The panel after that was one of tragedy, the woman, now limp, being mourned. But the story didn't end there. The final, largest panel was a scene of pure horror. A creature, recognizably female with long, flowing hair that obscured its face, descended from the trees. Its fingers were elongated into wicked, sharp claws, and its white dress was stained with something dark. It was depicted terrorizing the villagers, who were shown fleeing in panic. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just art, it was a warning. A historical record of a nightmare. I pulled out my notebook again, my hands trembling slightly as I found the page with the single word scrawled at the top, Pontianak. As I read my own forgotten notes, the carvings on the wall seemed to animate in my mind. My research described the vengeful spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, just as the carvings depicted. It was said to take the form of a beautiful woman in a white dress with long black hair, a perfect match for the creature on the wall. The notes mentioned its ability to fly or levitate, and its use of sharp claws to disembowel its victims, details chillingly rendered in the terrified etchings before me. All the pieces clicked into place: the disembodied cries, the phantom scent, the impossible footprints. I wasn't dealing with a simple cryptid or an undiscovered species. I was facing a legend, a creature born of pain and rage. And this village, they hadn't just abandoned this place, they had fled from it. As that realization settled over me, a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the longhouse. It wasn't a draft from the decaying walls. It was a pocket of icy air that seemed to emanate from nowhere, raising goosebumps on my skin. And with the cold came a familiar, sickeningly sweet scent, frangipani. Then, from just outside the hut, so close it felt like it was whispering in my ear, came the sound. The long, sorrowful wail of a grieving woman. It knew I was here. It had followed me. It had cornered me. The wailing outside the longhouse was both a death sentence and an invitation. I could stay huddled in the rotting structure, a cornered animal waiting for the inevitable, or I could stop running. The thought was liberating. You can't outrun a ghost, but you can set a trap for one. The chase was over. The fight was about to begin. A parasa. My mind, now clear of the initial panic, raced back to my notebook. I didn't need to look at it. The words were seared into my memory. A weakness. Every creature I'd ever studied for the agency had one. For the Pontianak, it was a bizarre, almost surgical vulnerability. According to the folklore, a sharp iron object, traditionally a nail, driven into the hollow at the nape of its neck, would not kill it, but somehow sever its connection to its rage. It would revert to the form of a beautiful, docile woman, its curse broken. I wasn't interested in taming it. I was interested in stopping it. I had no iron nail, but I had 8 inches of agency-grade steel. My combat knife would have to serve. The first step was a calculated risk. I had to go back to the plane crash. The trek through the jungle was nerve-wracking, every shadow and sound a potential ambush, but I needed resources. I scavenged the wreckage, prying loose, jagged shards of the fuselage and stripping out lengths of wire from the control panels. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic, focused labor. My forgotten knowledge of physics and engineering took over. I found a dense grove of bamboo near the abandoned village and spent hours sharpening stakes, their ends honed to viciously sharp points. I embedded these in the ground around a narrow game trail leading to the village, concealed by leaves and loose soil. It was a crude but lethal pit trap. A few feet before it, I rigged a tripwire using the salvaged wiring, connecting it to a string of metal shards that would rattle and clang, a primitive alarm system. I wasn't just building a defense. I was choosing the battlefield. I used sap from a sticky vine as a crude adhesive, reinforcing the tripwire mechanism. My hands, calloused and steady, moved with an eerie efficiency that felt alien to my conscious self. This was the work of the man I used to be, the agent, the hunter. And for the first time since the crash, I felt a spark of him return. Not as a memory, but as pure, cold competence. As the sun began to bleed out below the horizon, my preparations were complete. I didn't retreat to the shelter of the longhouse. I chose my own ground, taking up a position in the thick branches of a gnarled banyan tree that overlooked the trail and my trap. From here, I had a clear line of sight. The jungle fell into its familiar nocturnal rhythm, but tonight, I was no longer just a listener. I was part of the silence, part of the waiting darkness. The air grew cool and still. The trap was set. My knife, its cold steel, a familiar and comforting weight, was held tight in my hand. I was ready for the ghost to come to me. It didn't arrive with a sound. One moment, the trail below my perch was empty. The next, she was there. Not walking, but simply standing, as if she had materialized from the moonlight itself. She was exactly as the legends described, a woman of ethereal, haunting beauty. A long, simple white dress, stained with a dark patch of what could only be old blood, clung to her slender frame. Her skin was pale, almost luminous in the gloom, and her hair, a river of midnight black, cascaded over her shoulders and face, obscuring all but the hint of a sorrowful mouth. She stood perfectly still, a silent, tragic statue. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain motionless, my breathing shallow. The tripwire was untouched, the trap remained unsprung. She hadn't used the trail, she had simply appeared beyond it. Then, she lifted her head, though her face remained hidden by her hair. The mournful wailing began, not from a distance, but from right there in front of me. It was a sound that didn't just enter my ears, it burrowed directly into my soul, a pure, concentrated expression of grief. It was mesmerizing, designed to paralyze. As the cry subsided, a soft whisper slithered through the air, a voice meant only for me. "Don't you remember her? The one you left behind?" The words hit me like a physical blow. An image flashed behind my eyes, fragmented and hazy. A woman's face, not this one, but one filled with tears. Sarah Chen? My sister? I couldn't place her, but the feeling of loss associated with the memory was a gaping wound. The creature was feeding on my broken past, using my own ghosts against me. "You failed her," the whisper continued, coiling around my resolve. "Just like you fail everyone." "No," I gritted out, the word a raw tear in the silence. It was a lie. It was a psychic attack. I had to break its hold. Fairy. My denial seemed to shatter its illusion of sorrow. The weeping stopped. The creature's head snapped up, and with an inhuman shriek of pure rage, she launched herself at me. She didn't run. She glided over the ground, a horrifying specter of vengeance. Her hands, once delicate, were now tipped with long, yellowed claws that sliced through the air. I dropped from the branch, hitting the ground in a jarring roll, narrowly avoiding her first swipe. Claws that could disembowel a man raked against the bark where my head had been seconds before. The fight was a blur of motion. This wasn't a physical battle in the conventional sense. Her movements were too fast, too fluid. I wasn't fighting a body of flesh and bone. I was fighting a manifestation of hate. I dodged and weaved, my agency training. That muscle memory from a forgotten life, keeping me alive by inches. She was relentless, a whirlwind of black hair and white linen, her shrieks echoing through the clearing. I needed to get behind her. I needed one clean shot at the nape of her neck. Feigning a stumble, I let myself fall backward, landing hard near the edge of my camouflaged pit. She saw the opening, her rage overriding her cunning. With a triumphant scream, she lunged, her claws aimed at my throat. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. I didn't try to stop her. I rolled sideways, hard. Her forward momentum carried her past me and directly over the weakened ground. With a crack of splintering bamboo, the earth gave way. She shrieked, this time in surprise, as she plunged into the pit, impaling herself on a dozen sharpened stakes. But it didn't kill her. It only held her. Thrashing and roaring, she began to pull herself free, the bamboo spikes splintering against her unnatural form. I had seconds. Ignoring the fire in my own leg, I surged forward. She turned her head, her face finally visible. A nightmare of twisted rage and black, empty eyes. As she opened her mouth to scream, I lunged, not at her face, but over her shoulder. My left hand grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head forward to expose the pale, vulnerable skin of her neck. My right hand, holding my knife, struck true. I drove the blade deep into the hollow at the base of her skull. Knuckus, there was no blood. There was only a sound, a terrible, deafening shriek that was part sorrow, part rage, and part release. It tore through the jungle, silencing every insect and animal for miles. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The night fell into an absolute, profound silence. The shriek faded into the oppressive silence of the jungle, and the body impaled in the pit went limp. For a moment she remained solid, the knife buried in her neck. Then, her form began to waver, like a heat haze rising from asphalt. The edges of her white dress dissolved first, followed by her pale skin and black hair. Within seconds, the entity that was the Pontianak disintegrated into a dissipating cloud of white mist, leaving behind nothing but broken bamboo stakes and my knife, which fell to the dirt with a soft thud. The jungle, which had been a place of relentless noise, was now eerily quiet. The oppressive feeling of being watched, a pressure that had been my constant companion for days, was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner. It was over. I stood there for a long time, my body screaming with exhaustion and pain. Every muscle ached. My leg felt like it was on fire. I retrieved my knife, cleaned it on the damp leaves, and sheathed it. There was no victory here, only a grim, weary survival. I didn't spare the abandoned village a second glance. This place was a tomb, and I had no desire to linger. I didn't wait for the sun. I picked a direction, east, where the dawn would eventually break, and started walking. I moved on, pure instinct, a machine running on its last fumes of fuel. The hours bled into one another, a monotonous rhythm of limping through ferns and ducking under vines. The jungle was just a jungle again, difficult, dangerous, but no longer haunted. It was well past noon when I heard it, a sound that was beautifully, wonderfully out of place. The low, rhythmic chugging of a diesel engine. Hope, a feeling I'd thought was extinguished, sparked in my chest. I pushed myself harder, crashing through the undergrowth with reckless abandon. Following the sound, the noise grew louder until I broke through a final wall of green and saw it, a wide, muddy river. And chugging slowly upstream was a small, battered fishing boat. I yelled, my voice raw and hoarse, and waved my arms frantically. The two men on the boat saw me, their eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of a haggard, bloodied foreigner emerging from the deep jungle. They steered the boat towards the bank, shouting questions in a language I didn't understand. I didn't care. I half stumbled, half fell into the shallow water, and they pulled me aboard. As the boat turned and headed back downriver, I leaned back against a pile of fishing nets, the exhaustion hitting me like a physical wave. I looked back at the impenetrable wall of green that lined the riverbank. This ordeal had stripped away another layer of my skepticism. The world wasn't just a collection of explainable phenomena that the agency cataloged and weaponized. It was older, stranger, and filled with things that defied neat scientific boxes, things that bled from folklore into reality. My fingers found the familiar cold metal of the tag around my neck. As I touched the stamped logo of the agency, a final, crystal-clear image flashed in my mind. Not a phantom from a ghost, but a genuine piece of my own memory. It was Marcus Thorne, standing on the tarmac, his face a mask of cold satisfaction as he watched me board the small plane. There was no ambiguity in his expression. He knew the flight was doomed. This wasn't an accident. This was an execution. Namia, Hikaf. They had thrown me away, left me for dead in a haunted jungle. They had failed. And as the boat carried me towards civilization, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My hunt for monsters was far from over. But now, I knew exactly which one I was hunting next.